Hey there, and welcome back to Modern World History with Dustin Fowler. In this video, we're going to take it a little step further. We're talking about Latin American revolutions, kind of stemming from the revolutionary ideas that started during the French Revolution. But what about Europe? I mean, we already talked about the Congress of Vienna, the agreement they come up with under Metternich's goals. They were trying to make sure that revolutions didn't occur again and preserve peace among European nations, which worked relatively well when it comes to countries fighting against one another. But unfortunately, the seeds of revolution had already been sown, and you couldn't undo it. So, just a quick review of political ideology. When we talk about this word ideology, we mean like people's perspective or how they feel about government and politics and economics or whatever it might be. And we've already established this, but really you can fit most people in the world and also most people in individual countries into one of three categories for the most part: conservatives, liberals, and moderates. Now, what I just said may be a little bit more simplistic, or I guess it may not be quite that simple, but nevertheless, conservatives want to keep things the same. All right, they prefer absolute monarchs. At this time, they prefer strong kings. They prefer nobility. They prefer a strong Catholic Church and things like this. Liberals, they want to change it up. They want to change everything. Nothing should be the same. Complete and total reform. Fight for the rights of the poor and of the middle class at the expense of the nobles and the aristocracy, the royals. And then moderates wanted to keep some of the same things that had always worked, and they also wanted to have some degree of change. They were not nearly as far to the right or to the left as your radicals. Radicals in this time period, in particular the left, they wanted to change literally everything. They wanted democracy for all. They wanted all of these different reforms that were going to completely change the social and political structure forever and ever. Now, the preference here was based on power and circumstance. So conservatives, usually they're going to be rich landowners, and then the nobility, the aristocracy, the church. No wonder they don't want to change anything. They have nothing to gain and everything to lose. Liberals, usually something like the bourgeoisie or a rich, educated middle class, they worked hard for what they had. They were rich, they were educated, they were middle class. They wanted to change everything because they wanted to have the power. They felt like they deserved it because they represent the better part of the people of the country. But moderates, or moderate liberals, still didn't want democracy and power extended to the poor and the uneducated. They wanted to, people that are rich or have some degree of power should be the ones who are calling the shots, and not everyone's intended to do that. So this is kind of where they were falling together as in terms of political ideology during this time period. Now, the greatest force that's going to happen at this time is going to be nationalism. And what this means is the greatest loyalty belongs to the people to whom you belong. All right. So what I mean by this is, if you look here at my example, the French, they speak French. They have a common history. They have common feelings about government. They have common, I guess, feelings towards Catholicism for the most part. Most of them were Catholic. I know we have some Protestant Huguenots, but most of them were Catholic. And they're also connected to the geography where France is currently located. So all these things together gives them a strong sense of personal identity. And that is what nationalism is. And that's how it works in the context of what we're talking about for this unit. So just to kind of sum up some definitions here, I wanted to talk about the differences between a state, a nation, and a nation-state. Now, some of you are going to get this when you take geography as well, but a state is going to consist of people, territory, and will have sovereignty. In other words, a government that can call the shots within its borders. That calls shots. So any government that can determine what they do within their borders has sovereignty. A nation, even though we kind of use the word nation loosely to mean state, like you watch the news, talk about our nation, a nation is going to be really a group of people with these characteristics that we defined up here. All right, this is the definition of a nation. Someone who is tied together with a group of people based on their common culture, history, and ancestry. A nation-state occurs when both of the definition of a state and the definition of a nation occur simultaneously. When people with a common culture, common geography, common history, and all these other things come together under one state, that's when you have a nation state. Okay, so now we have that out of the way. Here are a few charts that were in the textbook that I just stuck here into my notes, and you can kind of see that when we look at the bonds that create a nation state, these are the different things: culture, history, language, territory, that geography piece that we were talking about. Okay, all these things go in concurrently to help identify a national group, and there can be positive and negative effects of nationalism. We're going to talk more about that momentarily, but people within a nation can overcome their differences for the common good. They can overthrow colonial rule, or a few things that they can do. But they also can can spur or lead to competition between other states based on how, maybe ethnocentrism. You might believe that one state is better than another. You've got groups like the Nazis, which we're going to talk about in a few units coming up, they're going to emerge. Those are nationalist movements. And so there is definitely some good and there is some bad when it comes to nationalism. So nationalism in this case is going to mean loyalty to a nation, not necessarily the king. Okay? Now, sometimes a group might consider the king to be a part of their national identity, and you saw that with the emergence of states after the Middle Ages, such as France and England. But in the context we're looking at here, where they're loyal to their nation, the nationalists in the 1800s were predominantly liberals in this case, not conservatives. They wanted to change stuff because they did not feel greatly in line or in touch with their king over their national identity. So nationalism can be both a unifying and a divisive force. In Germany, for example, we're going to learn wanted to unite. The Austrian Empire wanted to separate because the Germans all felt like they were German, but they were just governed by several different states. And the Austrians, they're different people, different nations governed by one state. So you can see, and we'll talk more in depth about that later on. But the Greeks were the first Europeans to use this nationalistic fervor to separate from a stronger empire. And in this case, they separated from the Ottoman Empire. Now, the British, the French, and the Russians sat back and watched this happen, and they all supported it. The British, and the French, because of the historical legacy of the Greeks. All right, I mean, we know that the Greeks and Romans, for example, kind of factor into the Renaissance. They factor into the liberal arts, to the reading, to the stories, the humanism, all these different things that influence British and French history. And the Russians, because they are Orthodox Christians. All right, and so are the Greeks. The Greeks are also Orthodox Christians, and they were under the control of Muslims. Controlled by Muslims, because the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire. We've already talked about it in Unit 2. By 1830, many liberal uprisings had begun to occur in addition to what happened in Greece. So in Greece, everyone's okay with it. But in these other areas, like Poland, Italy, and the Netherlands, they were definitely not okay with that, because these are territories that were controlled by other absolutes. And as they gained power, these nationalistic movements happened, absolutism or conservatism was under attack. So everything that the Congress of Vienna set out to stop was starting to unfold and actually happen right before their very eyes. Now, these revolts were put down, but they were the start of something bigger. And once again, in 1848, you start to see revolutions occur. And once again, it looked like the Congress in Vienna was under attack. I mean, all these different plans were not going to happen. And the really ground zero for this was going to be France. Now, France, under King Charles, was replaced by a liberal reformer. The thing is, King Charles had tried to reinstitute absolutism, but France was, at this time, a constitutional monarchy, like constitutional, kind of like England. Remember, we talked about the Glorious Reformation, or the Glorious Revolution, and so France, after the Napoleonic era, they were not absolute monarchy; they were a constitutional monarchy. And when King Charles tried to kind of reestablish absolutism. The bourgeoisie, the third estate, they kind of flipped out, and they ended up getting this liberal reformer named Louis Philippe. They had him put into power, and by 1848, the French people are ready for even more changes. They want outright, straight up democracy. The monarchy was overturned and a new republic was established, but here's the thing, is that the radicals couldn't agree. They were basically two different sides, and they fought in the streets, and they competed with each other over influence, just like kind of like what they did during the French Revolution. And some of them wanted just political reform, others wanted political and economic and all kinds of reforms, and some were more radical than others. And so eventually, this is going to lead to a more moderate constitution, because people in France are getting kind of nervous about the crazy ideas of these left-wing radicals that are starting to float around. And so they established a moderate constitution and elected a new president named Louie Napoleon. Now, Louis Napoleon was the nephew of Napoleon. Nephew of Napoleon that we talked about, the Emperor Napoleon, and he ends up calling himself, holy mess, Emperor Napoleon III. No, wait a second, wait. He was elected president. He won an election. So how in the world is he going to become Emperor Napoleon III? Well, when he did it, honestly, the French people were okay with this, because a strong leader is what they need that can create some degree of order and stability in France. And so nobody really fought this decision, and needless to say, Emperor Napoleon III did, in fact, make France a prosperous nation once again. And here is what he looks like. Now, this brings us to Russia. Russia is, several units ago we talked about Russia for the first time. They haven't really been around that long. They were under control of the Mongols for a huge amount of time. They were still doing feudalism, and the Tsar, and really, they had never been able to get rid of this, even despite the fact that you've got some like Catherine the Great who kind of teetered with the idea of getting rid of feudalism, and all these different czars wanted to do it, but they needed it because czars needed the nobility. And it just so happens that nobilities, the nobles, the aristocrats, they were the ones who were imposing feudalism on the peasants of Russia, because they benefited from it. So the nobility, the landowners, benefited from having these peasants do all this work, when then they were able to export their crops and be super rich. But so czars wanted to get rid of feudalism for a long time because they felt like it was holding up their progress, but they couldn't really institute any kind of real reform because of the nobility would freak out and would challenge their power. So even though you can see that Russia was absolute monarchy, they still depended on the nobility. And so, since there was nobility and there was serfdom, there was really no industries. And really it was a problem, because Russia's they're not very modern, and it's starting to show. It's starting to show. Many Russians hated the system of the feudalism and the serfdom and the lack of industries, and the czars were woefully aware of it. So, hoping to somewhat kickstart this move to Russia becoming a stronger state in the world's stage, in 1853, the Crimean War took place, and the purpose here, what Russia was trying to do when they started this war, was they were trying to really get land from the Ottomans. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire was starting to deteriorate. All right. Now, the reason why I hesitate there is because really the Russians used their status as a defender of Orthodox Christianity as a means by which they could justify their invasion. But the thing is, the Ottoman Empire was weakening, and Russia saw this as an opportunity for them to go in and get some of this land that would give them control of Constantinople, maybe get them control of the Holy Land as well, and help them to establish a port in the Mediterranean, or some kind of warm water port that could give them access to the rest of Europe and prevent their isolation and their technological backwardsness. And so this is really a significant and overlooked war with some pretty serious implications. So let's break it down. Russia, being Orthodox Christian, they wanted to protect Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman-controlled regions. They already had supported the Greek Revolution of the against the Ottomans because they were Orthodox Christians that we just mentioned. But they also wanted to protect Orthodox shrines and Orthodox cathedrals and anything like that that was that existed in Turkey under Muslim rule. And the French under Napoleon III wanted to kind of do the same thing except for Catholicism. Here's the thing: Napoleon had already established the Second Empire. He wanted to reaffirm and reestablish and recommit to the Catholic Church. He wanted to improve his relations there, and so he saw this as an opportunity for him to establish his prestige as a ruler of France, as well as a protector of Catholic Christianity. And so he was kind of, bumping heads and competing with the Tsar over the issue of how to handle the Christians in the Muslim territories. Now, in actuality, what I've already said here is that the Russians wanted to control Constantinople. The French wanted to demonstrate their leadership under Napoleon III, and so really, in a lot of ways, this was a political squabble between the two. Britain had tried to mediate this whole argument with defender of Catholicism, defender of Orthodox Christianity, with the two, but Russia and France would not have any of it. The Ottoman Empire completely disregarded the agreement they had come up with, and so as a result, Russia invaded the Ottoman Empire, and the Crimean War begins. So Britain didn't want Russia controlling the Balkans and Constantinople because what they feared was that this was going to upset the balance of power that was set up in the Congress of Vienna. All right, now remember, this is a long time ago. Okay, we haven't had a war for a very long time in Europe. And so Britain didn't want this. Russia actually thought that Britain was going to maybe side with them because the Ottoman Empire wasn't really worth protecting at this point. But they were very, very wrong in that. And the British put the balance of power above all else and sided with the French. And so they go in. Meanwhile, Russia is beating the Ottomans. They can actually handle the Ottomans. The Ottomans were super weak at this time. But the problem is, once the English and the French got involved, the tide began to turn, and many casualties would take place due to terrible leadership on both sides, as well as just new technology and other different factors that would lead to high casualties. Some of the impacts here of the Crimean War, among other things, was this ensured that the Ottoman Empire was going to survive until World War I. It demonstrated the necessity of a strong navy for global wars, all right, because this is one of the things where the Russians really fell short. Their navy was so sad, honestly, it was pitiful. It demonstrated just exactly how backwards their technology was, as though they needed that. I mean, as though you can't look in other places and see that was happening already. They also established that Russia was desperate in need of modernization, which they already knew. Most of the Russians that died, there were about 500,000 Russian casualties, and this was mostly due to sickness and malnutrition, simply because the Russians didn't have the infrastructure and the technology to get supplies to their troops. And so that would be a theme that you're going to see return again in several wars, the most notable being World War I. Alexander II comes into power, and he abolishes serfdom. So we were talking about this earlier. So Tsars were really afraid of doing this because it might insult and infuriate the nobility. But he went ahead and did it. Now, it was only a halfway. It was only a halfway abolishment because the peasants would have to pay the government for their land for up to 49 years, which meant they can't buy land from the government. They're still going to be stuck to the land. But what it does is it gives them an out. 50 years later, there's not going to be any kind of serfdom in Russia, which hopefully is going to be able to lead to more industries. All right. So under Alexander III, Russia is going to begin industrializing, and this move is facilitated by, you guessed it, nationalism. So the Russians begin to think, hey, we're weak, we need to be better. They rallied behind their goal to industrialize, and this right here kind of fueled Russian nationalism. We're going to talk more about the powers of nationalism in the next video. Thanks for watching.